So thank you so much for coming today. This event is part of HALB's Women's Leadership Speaker Series and is being co-hosted by HALB and the Women's Law Association. We're very excited to have Maureen Sherry with us today, a former managing director at Bear Stearns and national best-selling author. After 12 years on Wall Street, Maureen Sherry, formerly the youngest managing director at Bear Stearns and a Cornell graduate, switched gears to earn her Master's of Fine Arts at Columbia University and to write. Her first novel for adults, Opening Belle, is a national bestseller and is currently being readied for the big screen by Reese Witherspoon. In collaboration with Warner Brothers, Reese Witherspoon will be producing and starring in this female-driven Wall Street comedy film. Ms. Sherry has also written numerous articles and spoken extensively on the topics of sexual harassment and gender in the workplace. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Maureen.
Thank you. Thanks, Elizabeth. I just want to thank Elizabeth for being on this really early, because when she reached out to me, it was sort of, I can't remember if it was pre-Me Too, but I think it was. And so my hat's off to all of you two for kind of being on topic and caring. And I know Elizabeth has a bunch of questions she wants to ask, but before she does that, I did ask if I could just, kind of make a simple statement, because for somebody who is older than you and has maybe in a different generation of a working life than you are, one thing that when I talk to women who are all like directors or partners of different investment banks in my generation, one thing we all sort of feel terribly about is that we wish we had been better at speaking up, not just about little things that happened, but for one another. And so as you all go out into the great big world and do great things, that's something that I keep thinking that in retrospect, people will say to me like, oh, if you ever talk to people who are, to younger people, please keep that in message. And I think that is sort of what we're hearing with Me Too, but I cannot tell you how I would say my generation feels slightly complicit that things have gotten to the point that they have gotten to. And I think that that's all changing, so that's all very exciting. That's my little soapbox pitch there.
Awesome.
Okay.
So to start from the beginning, you graduated from Cornell in 1986. So Cornell, 1986. Could you just briefly describe why you decided to go into finance and what you were hoping to achieve with your career at that time?
I thought she was going to ask me why I went to Cornell. So why finance? So yeah, it's a simple question. I graduated with a bunch of student debt, and so I had two job offers, and one was for literally $25,000 a year, and one was for $60,000. So it was a simple mathematical equation. The other thing, though, that I thought was really important is that I wanted to be in sales. I liked being around people. I like numbers. And so I really thought about, well, sales is sales. And so sometimes it doesn't matter what you are selling. And what happened for me was a few years into it, I really, really loved my job. I loved research. I loved learning about different companies. I learning about impact companies were having on other things and how to look at the world as a whole. And so it really opened my mind. We talk a lot about first-generation college students, and I don't know if we think enough about first-generation office workers, and of which I was one. So my parents are from Ireland, and my mom, they'd come here. My mom got a teaching degree and became a teacher in Harlem, and my dad had a group of jobs, but they were things like in the dairy department of a grocery store, and then a doorman, and then he eventually ended up at AT&T, but never, because he didn't have a college degree, never really had been in an office, and I hadn't been in one either until I was suddenly on a trading floor. So sometimes, that's another thing, that if you're exposed to things that you find questionable behavior, but you're sort of going along with it because you really haven't been keyed in, and back then people didn't really do, the whole concept of an unpaid internship to me was something that I didn't get at all, so didn't understand why anybody would work for nothing. So I think that explains also a lot about why sometimes in a particular generation there is this ability to put up with behavior that now I think people are more sensitive to.
And could you briefly describe the types of work assignments you worked on, and then the fact that you were the youngest managing director in Bear Stearns history? Like, how are you able to advance so quickly?
So I was very fortunate. Sometimes timing, as we know, is a big part of it. And what happened for me was I worked in a department where it was a bit of a cowboy department, and it was pretty much you could, as they kept saying, eat what you kill. I hate that phrase, but you know what it means. It's like commission driven, and it's really whatever you wanted to make of that job. And for me, I was interested in that, but I was also interested in the high yield markets. And so the high yield meetings were at the end of the day, so I could go to those. I started to cross-sell products to the same institutional clients. So I think you all know what those are, money managers and et cetera. And it is a client-driven business. So as I became, I think, better at my job and my relationships with my clients got stronger, that was something that really helped me. I was very attracted to the quantifiable number being as part of your compensation, because if you're bringing in a certain amount of commission, obviously you're going to be paid a certain amount. What I wasn't quite prepared for was how people can figure out a way to make what you think is a hard figure a variable amount, but that's another story. The other thing that was happening at that time that doesn't happen now is there were less stringent walls between departments. So for instance, Latin America was booming. I was able to do a lot in Latin America, equities and fixed income. And so, so I built a nice business because there was a lot of this was just growth-driven with not a lot of rules. Partially that was just the culture of Bear Stearns, and partially that was Wall Street at the time.
So shifting gears, it sounds like your job was really intellectually engaging, but how did you find navigating the culture?
So the culture of the place, I did like the roll-up-your-sleeves culture, and no offense to anybody here, but we had a CEO who liked to say that he didn't like to hire MBAs, and he liked people who were sort of self-motivated, self-made, that sort of thing. One of the most amazing vignettes I had, this was Ace Greenberg, he sat physically close to me because he liked to be on the trading floor because he felt he had a much better pulse on what was going on if he did. And so he used to sometimes give rides home to people if he had a driver, and if he saw you leaving, and the driver would take him home, you'd talk to him, and then the driver would take you to your apartment if you lived around him. So I'm dropping him off, I guess, one night, and I realized that the building we've dropped in is the same exact building on Fifth Avenue that my dad had been a doorman at. And so he gave me this little lecture about this is why I love America. Sometimes it just takes one generation and this sort of thing. And so that explains part of that culture. Despite it being a very lucrative business and a lucrative job, he also had a really sense of, he's famous for when you got your job, besides signing an arbitration agreement, which we'll talk about in a bit, he would give you a box of paper clips and say you get one box for however long you work here, because he never understood how people could just go through endless boxes of paper clips and things like that. So that was sort of the culture. The other part of the culture was obviously heavily male, obviously on a trading floor, very much geared toward testosterone, betting, that sort of thing. So there was lots of betting on just about everything. And so partially, some people would find it as a woman maybe offensive. Some women felt you had to become more like that to be accepted and to excel. I put myself somewhere in the middle. Being from a largish family, and I was had a little bit more of a thicker skin about stuff like that. But one thing, and maybe this is the guilt I was talking about earlier, that I'm very sensitive to is, as part of my job, became hiring people. So I go out to really excellent business schools and hire really excellent candidates. And women would often ask me, oh, what's the culture like of the place? And because I had spent a few years at Drexel, which is also another firm that is no longer in existence. So I have an excellent track record. But I had, it was really the majority of my experience. And so I thought it seemed fine. And I thought that this was the kind of stuff, you just had to look out for yourself, and that you had to be kind of tough. I remember one person said, only hire women who have brothers. So that was sort of the mentality there. But the culture, would I say it's supportive? It is to a point, entry level, excellent, and then it all sort of falls apart. And so I felt very badly that after usually 2 or 3 years, many of these MBAs would leave, citing a culture that they were very uncomfortable being in.
And so about the culture, were you able to talk with your other female colleagues about this? And when did you start becoming comfortable discussing those? Because I think you wrote an article discussing the glass ceiling club you had where you informally met up. So.
Yes. So we like to think, you watch TV and you see Sex and the City or any of these other, The Office, or where people really bond together and they share secrets. And I have to say, and I've never worked at a law firm, but I have to say that my experience was quite different. Women tended to be kind of uber professional, whereas men sort of would feel free to be themselves, I'd say, or else to even egg one another on to be a worser version of themselves. I feel women were really kept to themselves, and I feel even to this day that there is this pressure to be what I call Pinterest ready. They look great, they never seem to have a problem, they really are, they keep almost to themselves. And I think a lot of that, and it's not just about, it's any minority, it's about being so outnumbered. And so to answer your question, we did not really speak to one another, except for one particular night that I still remember, which went something like this. It was the office holiday party. It tended to be a completely off the hook, you can tell I have kids, event. And at this event, there was pretty outrageous stuff going on, and we sort of all found ourselves herded together, women, and we were physically separated. On the floor, some were from banking, some were from research. And we just found ourselves together, and one very more junior person said, did anyone else get diamond earrings with their bonus? And, so no. And so we started a conversation, and it was the first time we had really spoken, and it wasn't the place to do it. We agreed to meet again. We called ourselves the Glass Ceiling Club, and that it became a thing. And what was different with us is these other major banks were having major class action lawsuits at the time with major settlements. And we didn't have that because I felt like we actually liked the place, and we felt like we would be suing each other. And we also really, I guess, drank the water of being on a team. And so what we decided to do was we wanted to change the culture. So we reached out to, I knew some partners, female partners at both Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs. We met with them. They were not that interested. And then we just did it with ourselves. And so we set up a meeting with our CEO. By this time, it had changed to a man named Jimmy Kane. We set up a meeting with him, a series of meetings. And the idea was that he was to meet with small groups of women, 6 to 8 women at a time, and we were to share stories. So I went to the first one, and we're sitting around, and the first woman to speak went into this unbelievable speech about she's never had such an opportunity in her whole life, and she's so grateful to be here, and thank you very much. And then there's dead silence. And this is a typical example where no woman wants to be the first one, right, to fire the first shot. We're in this incredibly awkward situation. There's one of those recording things in the desk there, so somebody's recording this somewhere. And so it was very uncomfortable. And then finally, a woman, she was from the Boston office, and she spoke up and she said, I cover this account with another person. There's some all-male golf club here in this area, and he's always taking them there, and I can't cover them as well, and it always feels very unequal. And so that's where it started. And in the middle of this, he takes a phone call, our CEO, and then he said, well, if that's all there is to talk about, then there's obviously no glass ceiling, or we wouldn't be sitting in this room with him. And that was the end of that. And so it fizzled. And then other things happened because there was this continual stream of women who were leaving individually. They were choosing to leave individually. As you know, they'd signed these arbitration agreements. They would receive a very large sum of money, and they would leave, never to work on Wall Street again.
So could you describe how you transitioned from writing or to writing?
So yeah, it wasn't like I left Wall Street, said I need to write a book about it. I have 4 children, and so so the way we worked, the quantifiable number again, is you weren't paid for your maternity leave. You could leave, but you would then have to have other people cover your accounts for you, and they would receive the compensation for that. So the incentive is to get back to work very quickly. I literally know someone who was back within, I'd say, 10 days. And because she was the sole, like many women in America right now, the sole breadwinner in her family. And so it was torturous. And so she was there very quickly. I stayed out for about 5 weeks. And we had one thing that happened while I was out was a man had a heart issue. So he was out for almost the same amount of time. And it was very interesting. Not that, he should have been home. He was ill. But there was this feeling of circle the wagons around him. We're all going to support Jerry, and we're going to, they did great business with his accounts. It all went into his account, and so I finally used that as an example. When I was leaving with my boss, I said, maybe things like this we could be a little more sensitive about. And he said, well, Jerry didn't choose to have a heart attack. You chose to get pregnant. So that was so I diverged, but I kept having these snippets that I thought, I got to write an article is what I kept thinking. But I thought I wanted to do financial journalism. And so I went, because I thought it would be a good job that would have far more flexibility for my family. So yeah, while I was at Columbia, I started in the journalism. I swapped to do an MFA in nonfiction writing. And while I was there, I would write a few stories about Wall Street. And I had this great professor, and she said, these are so much fun to read, but this is a nonfiction class. I said, no, these are true. And she's like, no, they can't be. So I wrote a book, and it was called The Glass Ceiling Club. And the reason none of you have read it is because this is what happened. It took a lot of time to write because it had to be completely vetted. And that means that certain women had to tell their stories. And they did. So they were essentially outing themselves. They were essentially limiting their career in some ways. And so it took a long time to get done. My publisher was Hyperion, which is part of the conglomerate of ABC, Disney, Hyperion. And so the way it works in publishing, some of you probably know this, but the editor buys the book, and then it goes, it's a little bit backwards because they buy it, and then it gets up to the higher ranks. They clear everything a little bit later on. Publishing has very little money. They do not have deep pockets. So anything litigious, they try to stay away from. And what happened is this book was done, and it got up to the higher rank, and then suddenly they realize on this conglomerate that who does their banking business but Morgan Stanley, Bear Stearns, and exactly the firms that I talk about in the book. So the book got killed, and you can still see it on Amazon. It breaks my heart, and it looks really pretty. And it just says currently not available. So, and I got a large advance to write the book, and nobody asked for a penny of it back. So it was disappointing. And so my agent, who I love, had come to me and said, Chiclet's really in these days. And I thought, doesn't that kind of miss the whole point? Like it's now going to be Chiclet. So I licked my wounds. My kids were of reading age at that time. I really like history and architecture and things like that. So I wrote a book about New York City called Walls Within Walls for the 8 to 12-year-old market. And it was just nice. Nobody's suing me. It's just a kind of a happy place. But this was the story I couldn't let go. And because so many of my friends were still in the business, and here we were so many years later, and I would still hear things that I thought could not possibly be true. And the way that their voices were snuffed out, and the way that they were not able to ever organize really frustrated me. So I wrote it again as a novel, and I tried to make it a smarter novel where the business stuff I kept to was pretty much close to the truth, and the family life is totally made up. And so And so I also tried to bring in other elements that I thought were pertinent to people. Like, people really cannot see inside this hyperbarically sealed world of Wall Street. When I left, I did not sign a non-disclosure. I did not take any money. And there was no big event that happened to me, even though I had I read some of the complaints people are having now, and so my friends and I, we text each other and say, if that's worth $1 million, then my booby jokes are worth us. So there's a lot, there was a lot of history there that people were worked up about. But I started this other book came out, and I tried to address things like working families, dads who stay home when they have a partner who is the primary or sole breadwinner in the house. To do that, looking around Manhattan, I had a very hard time finding men in that role. In fact, I'll tell you how I found a group is walking my own kids to school. I noticed there was this one dad who had a very young child, 10 in the morning, would still be like pushing the swing all by himself. And I walked up to him, creepy lady going to the playground by herself. And I said, are you staying at home? And his wife had a very big job. She was a lawyer. And he says, yeah, we call ourselves stay-at-home dads, sad dads. So, yeah. And so that was a whole other, so there's an element of that comes into the book too. And then I bring in some of the antics that are very similar to the things I witnessed. I always talk about the story of my very first day of work. These guys came over to me. I was 20, I don't know, 3 or so, and raises a top of a pizza box, and instead of pepperoni, there are condoms all over it. And that was my initiation. And they're doing it not to see me blush or whatever it is I did. I think men did it for one another because it's funny, and it's fraternal, and it makes them laugh, it bonds them, and it's funny, not funny. Yeah. So, yeah. I think I answered your question.
Yeah, definitely. So opening Belle was a national bestseller, highly successful. Were you expecting it to be so successful? And what was the general reaction to the book?
Before I wrote the book, I'd written right before the book was published, I had written an article, an op-ed in the New York Times, the title of which is "My Colleague Drank My Breast Milk and Other Wall Street Tales." And so in it, I talked about a few of these stories. But the arch of the story was supposed to have been about arbitration. And it went to the top of the most, looked at articles, et cetera, because I think people couldn't believe that this was still going on. And I got so many texts and emails and stuff to my website, and they were mostly not women in finance. There are women in law. There are women in research. Women in education. Women. I couldn't get over because I really thought it was sort of an insulated problem because our world I felt was kind of private, and I found through that it wasn't. And so I kept thinking it would be cool to have a blog or something where people, because some of these stories were really interesting. The way power was used was and the manipulation and politics and media, but now we know all this, right? This was only I guess 2 years ago. And then Me Too happened. And so I think that I often say I'm the only woman that Harvey Weinstein has actually helped her career. So it has helped sell the book, yes.
And then moving on to how it's being made into a movie now.
Yeah.
Reese Witherspoon's going to produce and star in it along with Warner Brothers. How did that collaboration come about?
So right now, when a manuscript is purchased, it is almost immediately, if it reads kind of like a movie, which is almost every book, is sent to Hollywood. Many agents have sort of a Hollywood partner. And they look them over, and there's such a, as we know, there's such a hunger for new material with not just movies, but with television. Television's gotten so much smarter. And so it happened even before the book was published, and it was kind of heady in that I was really drawn to the women who were responding to the manuscript because these are women who are famous actresses who are no longer 25 and maybe physically perfect, and they're smart, and they're thinking, what do I want to do next? And so many of us in this room will have, your own careers, I'm sure will have many, many different stories and derivations of what you initially thought while you sit here in this room today. And so, yeah, there were 3 in particular who were very interested. They're all well-known names. She was by far, my favorite pick just because At the time, she said she was looking for a grown-up Legally Blonde. Well, how incredible that we're sitting here talking about this. And then we've all seen what she's done, right? She has stood up for Time's Up. She started Time's Up, and she's really, really gotten herself, rolled up the sleeves, and gotten into this movement. And going out, I did get to go out to California, and her co-producer on everything, brilliant. They did Big Little Lies together too. Is this woman, Bruna Papandrea. And what I loved is everything they were saying really hit me, because they wanted the mess. They wanted a wider audience. If you're going to have an on-the-nose, hit over the head, feel-bad movie about the terrible, you could do that. And who's going to go but people who already have drunk the Kool-Aid, people who already feel that way about a certain issue. Or you could do a Wolf of Wall Street, which is totally fun to watch and is also so highly exaggerated that people will go to watch, but they won't leave feeling like compelled to do anything. So we were trying to hit something in the middle.
And so this is one of the first female-driven Wall Street comedies. So
Yeah.
how do you feel about being one of the first, and how do you think media representation has affected you in real life?
So to the first part of the question, I would say this. Originally, Warner Brothers had this screenwriter who they loved, and he came to New York, and he was terrific. He had a background in Pixar, so loved animation and cool special effects, right? So he comes, and the problem was he didn't have a background in finance. And so I'm sure you have sat in some movie where there's a lawyer, and you're thinking, this screenwriter didn't know what they were talking about. But for me, who doesn't know that much about the law, I'm like, that's a happy movie, it's fine. And what again, with the Bruna and Reese combo really want is, they want it to be true. They want it to be valid. They want it to be something people can believe in. One thing we're doing is setting the movie in 2008, because that's pre-electronic trading, right? So it's there's a lot more movement, a lot more action. There's a lot more inappropriate behavior that's overt and in your face, and we could do that. And there's, a mortgage crisis that we can explain to people in a way that is highly understandable, which is, the book also happens at that time, because we didn't talk about women and financial literacy, but that's another thing that burns me, because I feel, how can we have women now being such a huge percentage of breadwinners in this country and not have them manage their money well? Anyway, so one crazy thing that happened, though, back to the movie stuff, was Matthew came, we spent this time together, he wrote a screenplay, it was very, very entertaining, but there were a lot of things that didn't really jive, and they weren't hitting it hard enough, because the thing that, when I spoke to Warner Brothers about, that I cared greatly about, is that the idea of a woman being ambitious, not mean or sharp-elbowed, but just ambitious, because she worked hard and she's been told her whole life that the sky's the limit, and why isn't it the limit, and that be a really big part of it. And it was very hard for him to bring that into the movie, and so they gave me this tiny, tiny little project, which was to write a very tiny part of Laura Dern's character in Big Little Lies. And I didn't know I was trying out to write a whole movie, but that was sort of heady and excellent, and I loved that whole HBO series. I don't know if any of you have seen it. But after that, they said, well, take a stab at writing the whole movie. And so I wrote this, I bought a book, Screenwriter for Dummies, and started. And it was very cool to learn something else. It's fun to write in a way where it's all dialogue, and you have to keep it moving, and I'm not that visual, but I've tried to become a more visual human. I don't think you can grow that part of your brain, but I'm trying. And so then they let me do it, and we've had a lot of back and forth, and I have huge respect for Hollywood writers now, because I guess I had thought it was sort of such a commercial industry, and it's not. They're super smart people who spend a lot of time and thought into what gets out there. And so yeah, that's been I've gotten to go out there a number of times and be like a kid in Disneyland walking around these lots, and I feel like they're trying to do the right thing, and I'm hoping it comes out that way.
So shifting gears a bit, could we go back to talking about the mandatory arbitration agreements, non-disclosure agreements, and how that fits into the Me Too movement and that sort of thing?
So I think it's clear how I feel about it. One of my greatest sources in writing is a man who has a huge legal practice in New York. He handles sexual harassment almost exclusively on Wall Street. And so he told me so many stories that were, closed files. And they're so much more outrageous than anything that you have read about in the newspaper. And it's interesting in Me Too, right? We've now seen media and Hollywood and banding together, kind of saying, let's clean up our act and let's just change it all now. Wall Street's been very quiet. And so the woman who broke the whole Enron thing, Bethany McLean, is doing an article for Vanity Fair that you should all read. It hasn't come out yet, a couple more weeks. And she really is trying to figure out why. And so I put her in touch with some good sources. I felt I had a decent handle on it. There's a few reasons. One, fear of retaliation, because it's a very lucrative job. It's not like you can just change careers and ever have the same sort of compensation. It takes a very, very long time. So there's that. I think about what happened with that first book getting killed. It's like it's a very closed world. The other is the inability of women to sort of form a posse, and for that to happen, what needs to happen is men have to stand up for them. I think that is happening now more than ever. I think men want this to go away too. They just want it to be a pleasant work environment for the most part. And I would say, there's some that say, oh, well, Wall Street went through this 10 years ago and we cleaned house and it doesn't exist anymore. And to that, I would say that is not true. So when I did go back and put these contacts in touch with Bethany, people like to tell me stories. One, here's a good example. The way human resource departments are set up. So you sign your arbitration agreement, you have a complaint, and sometimes your complaint is not egregious. It's just maybe a suggestion that you can't give directly to a boss for lots of reasons. In this case, he had lots of girlfriends. He would bring in these, she kept saying, the cute young blonde interns every summer, and he would have relationships with several of them, and it was consensual, but she thought the power play there was completely inappropriate. And so she went and spoke to somebody, and she didn't hear much back. She's out at a client, out of town at a client, and her secretary calls and she says, they're moving all your things. And she says, what do you mean? And what they did was they emptied her desk and moved her to a different area where she's now out of the information loop. Right? So nothing's happened, right? There's nothing that is actionable, but she's been physically out of the loop now, and she's went to then a sporting event, and at the sporting event, she sees the very same human resource person that she complained to at the sporting event with the very same boss that she complained about. So the way it is set up, this is at a major bank, is not right. So with arbitration specifically, the argument I hear against it is we'll have a lot of nuisance lawsuits. And I would argue that if there's nothing to hide, there's nothing to hide, right? And so the nuisance lawsuits will be nuisances and be thrown out of court. So I really would like to see arbitration, and you guys can make it happen and go away.
So do you think the changes that are happening with the Me Too movement and the fact that it started in Hollywood, do you think those will have a lasting impact, or is it just a phase?
No, I don't think this is a phase. This feels bigger than a phase. Yeah.
And then I think after this, we're going to open up for questions.
Okay. Right. One thing I did want to also mention too, with movies and law, and we often think that, I can't tell you how many, think of any movie where, they'll say like, oh, and he's a lawyer and he earns $5 million a year or something, right? They'll put a number to a character, and we will think that that character is, we have no opinion. We obviously he's successful, he's likable. And that doesn't happen for women. So in my book, and also in this movie, I had put real numbers down about her earnings, about what she paid for things, and it always came back to me edited out. And I always thought that's very interesting. Something about the way we think about women and ambition and earnings power is not right. So, so it came back to me, well, if she were Serena Williams and was just an incredibly talented athlete, then it's okay to put a number there. Or if it's, I don't know, pick a supermodel and she earns X a year, it's okay to put numbers next to her. But if you notice, you don't really hear that with individual women in business, law, places like that. Okay, I'm sorry. I have tangents sometimes.
So we're going to open up for questions. So does anyone have? Yes.
Well, so there has been, with these massive settlements, some, like Maureen Stanley is a great example. In their settlement agreement, they had to put a certain amount of money, I want to say $45 million, sounds right, towards this sort of thing. And that's a lot of money. You can do a lot with that. So they have a lot of, gender bias workshops and a lot of women's groups. But to me, the change has to come from the men. It has to be, because I do think that most people are good, right? And so they're not there to but I think when it comes to the very high-end, most profitable parts of a bank, it is our human, bias, which many of us have, you want someone like yourself, because that's who you trust the most, despite so many studies that show the more different backgrounds, the more voices, the more diversity you have at the table, you get a better outcome. So I think just the more studying that sort of thing versus having women's groups who just are in that, echo chamber thing is partially the way. I do think that having women who don't try to be perfect in front of the other women. It's a hard thing to describe, but I think having real interest in the other women's lives and having, supporting them if they have a family, which is something that many of you will come up against at some point. And so just general support rather than the eye roll. So I worked with a woman who was very proud of the fact that, she hid from us that she was married, which was bizarre, I think, right? And so, but she was just so driven, and she just thought that would immediately start to take away from how she was perceived. So it's understandable. But she said when someone found out and asked her about it in front of several others, she goes, well, I am married. She goes, but don't worry, I'm never having kids. Like, as that were some, career-ending event. And when you look at that companies that I think have really good family policies, it takes this edge off this extremism that we think, that these kind of heights out, these standards that we're holding both men and women to, and we're sort of embracing their humanness. So I didn't really answer your question, but I would just say it's to be more human, to use more, to call people on things. I have kind of a stronger personality, and so one thing that I started to feel empowered to do, which I did think helped people, was, I remember being at a boardroom table, I was the only woman, and we were talking about MLPs, right, Master Limited Partnerships, and some guy says to me, we talked about Anadarko, he turns to me and he says, that's a major petrochemical company. He didn't say it like that, but he's like, and he meant it to be helpful to me, and so I jokingly said back in front of everybody, thanks for the mansplanation or something. And I think it's important to just call people on those little moments, because then they don't become big moments, and they also help other people in the room to just be more aware. So, yes?
Do you have any theories looking back as to why Wall Street has produced the culture that is, sexist, hierarchical, greedy, etc.?
Yeah, I think, how did we ever get that to this point, you mean? I think Wall Street's gotten there because it was primarily all men, like so many businesses, and because it has because it is so lucrative, and those are coveted jobs, right? So who do you bring in? You bring in the person who looks like you, and then you can both have this excellent job and excellent experience together. The other thing that happened, though, that I was really aware of is many, because they are high-paying, you could afford for your partner to not work, right? And to have a family. So I think that became the norm. And so I think that men, here's a good example. This was not my experience, but for the movie, I interviewed a lot of women at different firms. And so she had 2 children, and she worked next to another woman, and the other woman had a baby and was leaving. They had a going away party for her. The big boss stands up and goes, let's all raise a glass to Susie. She's going home to be with her baby. She's doing the right thing. This was last year, So what's the message? I think that he just showed how he really feels. And so I think that how Big Boss really feels is that having a room surrounded by guys like them has always been the way, and still is. It's such there's no women who run a major investment bank, and in the C-suite itself, the percentage it's still very low. I think it's 13%, but that's including like every financial firm. So, yes.
Thank you very much for coming. I totally agree with the point that men should also be part of this effort.
Yeah.
But the question a lot of people raise is that, what if this like female coming up and taking my seat? And so I guess my question will be, how do you convince people who are like right now on the sideline that we are growing the pie together instead of like taking the seat from you? And how do you make a convincing business case to convince some of these CEOs?
It's interesting you don't feel that way, though, in the classroom, right? You don't think that, a woman is going to outshine me in any way. You just see each other as peers. And so it's always astounded me that men feel threatened by a woman. I do think there is a macho culture there that if you're passed over, if you're both up for promotion and the woman gets it, you feel a little emasculated, right? What did she have that I didn't have? And so what do you say? You say she got the job because she's a chick, right? Or something like that, right? So that definitely is a problem. And the flip side of that is I've had so many off-the-record conversations with people who work in HR and who work on a trading floor, and they'll say, I would love to work with more women. I feel very nervous promoting one to a particular big job because if she doesn't work out, I can't let her go. So in other words, women bring, baggage or something with them because they can either shine, or if they don't shine, I have a really big legal problem on my hands. And first of all, I don't think that's true. And second of all, it's a bummer. And it's also terrible that I'm hearing more and more about clients not wanting to be with, if their coverage, say, is by a female salesperson, that they don't want to be, say, at dinner with just the 2 of them. That now there has to be another person there. So I can't believe we've ever gotten to this point. Yeah.
Quickly building on that last point, I've often heard in the context of inside the company mentorship and older men being concerned about being seen alone with a younger woman. You would take the example that you gave earlier about you taking a ride home with the CEO.
Yeah.
You could imagine just like on the surface today that I'd imagine a lot of CEOs wouldn't feel comfortable with that, be concerned about that. What do you think is the right way of sort of correcting back, or what can we do, both men and women, to try to correct back to more of a reasonable equilibrium?
I think that's an excellent question, and I feel you're right. Would anyone ever get in the car with a CEO ever invite? No, never. And it's interesting too because there was a bit of a lot of investigations going on trying to figure out, were there any of these real higher ups on Wall Street who were somebody we should be watching, and is there any? And take Jamie Dimon, right, at JP Morgan, very gregarious guy, where I'm sure he's had these moments where I don't really want to, someone comes up to him and, a young intern wants to talk to him, and he's probably very happy from his soul to talk and share stories or whatever, and probably feels very awkward about it. I'm just totally, I don't know if that's true or not, but I would say that is true. How I think we go back is just greater numbers. I think the problem goes away. I look at other countries or places where there's just much more gender balance. And so I think if it were that way, it would be like in school again, or in any other, a lot of places in corporate America where there is just greater gender balance and there is not this peaked intensity of like who's doing what and who's talking to who and what's going on. So it's a real problem, and I don't really know the answer. Yes?
How did you get your agent, and did the Masters in Fine Arts help you in your transition from Wall Street into the professional world?
Yeah, I think the MFA did help, me. And I think that the agent was a student reading, and that he happened to be there. He was from ICM, and I just got very lucky. And also because it was something different. A lot of people, I was talking about a subject that there had not, at the time, been much written about. Yeah?
I was wondering, in your personal experience with other women, do you feel that the law is something that helps you, or is it completely against you? Like, do you ever feel that I have a legal right to not be treated like this, or I should try to enforce this in some way, or is it?
So I think the law, as it currently stands, you mean under arbitration or under? Yeah. So I always feel that transparency is your greatest friend for everybody in the end. And so the law could really help you in that situation. I think the way it stands now, it's rigged, because arbitration, you go to an arbitration panel, say I had a complaint, I go to an arbitration panel, well, who are they? They're people from industry. So they're part of already this mindset that, say, a judge or something would not particularly have a bias towards one way or the other. So that's what you're working with. So I don't think the law helps particularly. You know, I remember too, and this is not related to that so much, but when I would look at resumes, I worked for a guy who was very funny, but he would say, always look for trouble on those resumes. So his definition of trouble, it was things like this. Women who are involved with Take Back the Night. I don't know if that exists here, but okay. Women who have gender studies on there. I'm like, what? Like, you know, so he's joking, but he's not joking. Yeah.
Really intrigued me. I remember when I was working at a law firm, I handed a document to a partner, and he said, in the nicest way possible, said, "Thank you, dear." And I walked back to my office with a group of other juniors, and he had to come in, I think that's how he saw it. He had to come in front of all of these other juniors, apologize to me, and he was almost like a terror in his eyes as he apologized and said, "I didn't mean it like that. It just slipped out. I'm so sorry." And I mean, we had such a good relationship. He didn't mean it, you know, offensively at all. It was a bit offensive, but he didn't mean it that way, I suppose. But that led to a whole debate amongst us about how these strict legal rules are hurting women, because what my male colleague turned to me and said, that's why you guys are trouble, basically. Because our partner, he says something nice to you, and you get offended, and now he's in here with his tail between his legs, embarrassing himself in front of you. And it led to this, it was a huge deal. Mm-hmm. And I really struggled to articulate why stricter rules about protecting women in the workplace were not harming us and were actually essential. Yeah. I wanted to know what you would say. It is so hard to define where the line is, right? And so some women are very quick to be outraged. It's true. I worked with a complimenter. He was a lovely older man, and he was like Willy Loman, man. This guy just went in there and sold every day, and he was a complimenter. And he would say, "Oh, I really like your blue dress," and I like, you know, it was just his way. And I had some younger women who complained about the constant compliments, and to the point where I had to file a little report about him, and that felt really wrong to me. And it really, talk about tail between your legs. I felt it sort of broke this guy, you know, as an employee, because he had so much school spirit for the place, you know. So it is a very fine line, and I think, again, we just need a level of normalcy and I think that can happen with numbers and diversity in all its forms. Yes?
Thank you so much. I'm curious, we've talked a lot about what women think about, and senior men think about. Men in this room are more likely to be junior men than they are to be senior men anytime soon. Right. I'm curious as to what you think our role is as far as on the spectrum of invites that you might get that might be good career opportunities, but opportunities that women who are your peers aren't going to get. Like, what is our responsibility to accept invitations to a steak dinner, but turn down an invitation to a cigar, whatever it might look like? How would you draw that?
I think the way that corporate and legal and Wall Street is entertaining is changing, and I think it's changing for the better. It's not as much fun and not as outrageous, but it's so, you know, there is a real, you know, tendency now for exercise in all its forms, and your responsibility, it's not your responsibility to say, well, if you're inviting me to this steak dinner, is the woman I work with, is she invited too? Although, I think that'd be great, to say, but it sort of like doesn't that sort of make you feel a little uncomfortable to even say that? Instead of a gracious invitation that you're able to accept, you have to like stick it in their face that they're not doing it the right way. I feel like that's not going to be, as a junior person, your responsibility. I think that you'll hopefully work for somebody who has a blown open mind and is very super aware about this stuff. And so to mention it wouldn't be a bad idea. To mention that you feel a little funny accepting it is also, I think, a great idea. Again, transparency, communication, that stuff goes a long, long way with me. So, yes? Yeah. Yeah. So I always thought the reason it's so different is that the stakes are, we don't support families the way you do in Sweden, and the stakes are higher here, meaning money, right? You don't get compensated the same way there. And so I always thought that was part of it, and we're not maybe as a society, we're not as open-minded and as thoughtful in those ways. But you're right, it doesn't, but I did notice, did you see this article this week about how they followed men and women who took paternity and maternity leaves, which you do, right? And then afterwards returned to the workplace, that the women still had a discount in compensation, and the fathers who had taken an equal amount of time didn't. So there's something about that. Yeah. Oh. A sense of what? A sense of futility about what the culture overall has such a... I'm really optimistic. So I have 2 boys and 2 girls, so I'm sort of like totally neutral in all things gender. And I encourage my daughters to work on Wall Street. I think there's never been a better time, because I think we're going to catch this wave, and that you are going to see a big surge in numbers, and not just hiring, but in their ability to get to higher levels, and to not have women strive for these unattainable lives where they have to always look perfect, where they can't have children, or they never talk about their children if they have them, and that sort of thing. So I'm optimistic. It's not futile. Yes. Oh, yeah, no. Because I don't even have one. Right, okay. So you mean, so you're in a meeting and it's a concept, but wouldn't you say it to the whole table? You would say it to the whole table. You wouldn't directly address the one woman at the table. Yeah. Again, it's the openness.
All right. I think we have to wrap up
Thank
now.
you.
So
You're a great audience.
You.